going to create that increase in relapses. Wow, I really just got like off.
I loved the tangent you were about to enter. You were talking about how stress and mental health very much coincide with each other during this pandemic, and those in the minority group or who identify in those structures have to take care of someone else. So there's that other added pressure to it.
Yep. So we see that, and then we also see methadone clinics shut down at the start of COVID. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to handle it. And a lot of people who normally wouldn't get take-home bottles, so sometimes they'll do, if you're doing good on methadone, you've been on it for a long time, they taper you off of it. They somewhat reward you, and they say, here's a 30-day pill prescription. You don't have to come back to the clinic for 30 days. Awesome. So when COVID started, they did pretty much everybody got take-home bottles. So we saw this increase in stress, which is going to be an increase in relapse. And then we're literally handing addicts more methadone when they're more likely to relapse. And it's just that downward spiral. So we see they're less likely to be engaging in the treatment, not only just getting methadone, but also the access to the counselors and their social groups, who they see and who they get that stimulation from. And that regulation, that routine, their whole life is flipped upside down. And routine is so important in the recovery process that the astronomical effects of COVID on substance use behaviors we're not even beginning to see the iceberg of it. And a lot of what you can really compare it to is the effects of substance use, the increase in it, like after Hurricane Katrina. We saw huge rates of substance use in particularly low-income African-American United States citizens. And it's going to come again, because those are the most at risk for not having access to services, living in shitty circumstances that the government said, here, this is a nice home for you. And in reality, poor air circulation, no walking distance to schools, no grocery stores in their neighborhoods. How do you expect them to stay healthy when you're not giving them access to anything? It's just a hurricane.
Well, and access is always the number one risk factor, in a sense. I say risk factor because when I'm teaching my wellness course and I'm talking about, okay, it's just like you said, we know smoking's bad for us. I ask the first day, it's like, all right, what do you need to do to be healthy? Exercise, eat right. Great. Why don't we do it? Right? We don't want to. We don't want to. We don't want to. We don't have time. Oh, I don't have access to a gym. Like, it all boils down to access. I don't have access to free time to go to the gym. I don't have access to a grocery store. And I remember watching this clip from Jamie Oliver. I think it was either his TED Talk, where he shows a clip of these young kids. I want to say it's kindergarten, and obviously I'll fact check it's kindergarten, but that middle school age, not being able to recognize particular vegetables.
Right.
But it's like, how do you expect them to? And it's just like,
they've never seen it.
They've never seen it. And it's kind of the same concept of the show Queer Eye. In that first episode, Anthony, the food expert, right? He's with the first hero and he's like, yeah, I'm going to teach you how to make guacamole. And he's like, oh, what's in that? Like, not understanding that guacamole is avocado. Like, of course not. He's never seen it. So why would he know that that's what it is? So I think you're right in that we don't even know the after effects of this, both physically and economically and socially, because there are a lot of places that probably won't recover. I mean, Joe Rogan talks about there's so many comedy clubs that probably will not recover from this.
Oh, there's so many things that won't recover. And in terms, like you were just saying, so many people would blame that person for not knowing what an avocado is. How could you not know at this day and age, how could you not know what an avocado is? Right. And that's so much of the stigma that's tied into substance abuse is it's your fault. You know, I'm not gonna give my time or money to the drug addict who got addicted to drugs. Really? Like that's what so much of this world is. And that's why harm reduction policies are not where they should be. That's why we don't have access. We don't have methadone. Methadone clinics should be on the corner. It should be normalized that a methadone clinic is up the street, because your neighbor is trying to help himself get better by going to that methadone clinic, right? It shouldn't be that dirty spot downtown. And that's what actually happened in Springfield. They had the methadone clinic in the south end of Springfield, and it got such negative reviews from the community. And it's like these people are trying to help themselves get better, and you're gonna hate on that. I was actually stepping into your world of qualitative coding recently.
Oh yeah.
And I was going through an interview of one person, and he was a veteran. He didn't say what branch of the military he was in, but he was in Kuwait for years, and came back, was prescribed painkillers, got addicted to painkillers, started using heroin, is now on methadone, has been clean from heroin for, I think he said 11 years. But he brought up such a good point of, I was so quickly prescribed all of these painkillers and so quickly moved on to heroin. I lost everything. B, he brought up such a good point of, he used like the soccer mom example, and he was like, not only was it easy for me to access all these things, he said, the soccer mom up the street, she breaks her ankle and the doctors are prescribing her painkillers, and like that, she's addicted. And I, read that, and I was like, wow, like that really stood out to me. He's making such a good point. It can happen to anybody, really, really anybody. And then he followed it up by saying, but I had nobody, and that's why I dug deeper into this world of drugs. He goes, that soccer mom has money, she has access, she has friends and family to support her. So when they realize there's a problem, she's in treatment, right? As compared to him, who has nobody, not enough financial ability to get a car to get to the clinic, not even in the mental state or have the mental therapy or whatever he would need for any of that PTSD, anything that he had went through. And that's where we see that disparity, that immediate, disparity of anybody can get addicted, but these people who have access and can afford funding and can afford to miss, however much of work and keep it on the down low because it's so stigmatized, they're fine. And then everybody else falls through the cracks, and we have this opioid epidemic.
And here we are. Right.
And here we are. There's just millions dying constantly. The rates of overdose are like more than they have ever been. I know like it's close to 70% of all overdoses, death by overdose involves an opioid. And now we're moving on to fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid. 70% of overdoses contain an opioid. 70% of drug overdoses contain an opioid, and 70. So I like the 70 because it's 70% of all drug overdose deaths involve an opioid. Of those opioid involved deaths, 70% of them involve fentanyl. So fentanyl is like the leading agent in the opioid death overdose epidemic.
All right, so this is where my pharmacology comes in. But first, can you explain what methadone is?
Yes, absolutely. So there are numerous opioid agonists that are not technically heroin, and you might actually say this better than I would. But methadone or buprenorphine is a similar to an opioid that goes into your body, so you don't really experience as much withdrawal effects if you're coming off of heroin.
Gotcha.
And so we have it's really involved in like medication assisted treatment, which is an evidence-based practice for getting people off of heroin.
So it's not a placeholder, but it allows for the user to taper down from heroin, which is a much harsher drug than per se methadone. Not to say that there isn't effects that could occur from methadone, but we don't want people using heroin.
Right. Absolutely.
So, okay.
Yep.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to fentanyl now, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the expert more so in this, because this is your field of research. the way that I understand fentanyl is it works as a booster essentially, so it adds an extra high or a potency to whatever drug that it is you are using at the time. So if it's cocaine, if it is an opioid, if it is heroin, anything like that, it kind of boosts the potency. However, it's much more deadly, and it allows for the user to use less of whatever it is their stash is, but getting like the same, if not more of a high. I'm using the word high in this case for whatever it is they're using, which essentially is the point in quote unquote cost effective from what I've read.
Yep, that is correct. It's like 50 times more potent than heroin.
Which is what makes it even more dangerous. So like, let's say that someone goes on the street and they get it from their dealer, and the dealer
they think it's just heroin. Yep.
And next thing you know,
you shoot up the same amount that you always would, and it's 50 times more potent, and you overdose.
So is that often that might happen necessarily, or if someone, say, has a bad high where the stash that they've purchased has fentanyl and they realize it after the fact, is there a greater likelihood that they'll continue using that fentanyl with it because they feel that they have a better affinity to it now?
Unfortunately, yeah. We were looking at like willingness to use fentanyl testing strips, which is harm reduction. We could talk about that. But we did find that a lot of users, if they were to find there was fentanyl, that they wanted to keep using that. So it's kind of backwards, but it does make sense, especially in the substance user's mind of, this is going to get me more high and give me more of that reward. Of course I'm going to use it.
Of course.
So, yeah.
So would you say that harm reduction is more effective for someone who is a drug user? Am I using the right terminology in saying drug user?
Yeah. Substance user, drug user. Okay. So one of the big benefits of harm reduction and the big focus of harm reduction is the purpose of it is not necessarily to limit drug use. And I think a lot of people think that. The purpose of harm reduction is to limit harm that comes from drug use. So how can we do that? By allowing people access to clean needles. So does that, reduce harm? It reduces HIV or HCV transmission, harm reduction. If we have people who have access to Narcan and they overdose, we can bring them back to life, reducing that harm. If we have people who are still accessing drugs, still engaging in these risky behaviors, these harm reduction policies are really set in place to limit that harm. So that's the big focus of it.
Gotcha. So would you say some of the confusion with harm reduction and getting people to quit in general is people think that limiting harm is going to just make them not use ever again?
I think it's more the analogy of, if you talk about sex to 16-year-olds, they're going to have sex. It's if you give people access to clean needles, they're going to use more, which is not the case, at all. Research has shown it's actually, the use of needle exchange programs actually reduces the amount of injections in people. They actually have limited their injection drug use. Because they have access to services. They might see something and say, you know what, maybe I do want to go to treatment today. Or, you know what, maybe, this is available for me. Maybe I'll talk to a counselor today. Maybe I'll go to a group session when I was here to get a clean needle to use my heroin with. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit more of people think these strategies are going to increase drug use, when in reality they do not. They decrease injection drug use. They decrease HIV transmission. And they increase engagement in treatment.
It's kind of fascinating, though, that by providing someone with clean needles to do the harmful act, that they're less likely to do the harmful act. Do you think it's like do you think, using the teenager kind of analogy, it's one of those things of like, don't tell your teenager not to do something because they'll probably want to do it. Do you think that same kind of concept?
Yep. And especially with like so many substance users, and really, if you really have a substance use disorder, your brain is not functioning at maximum capacity. You've already